The Thorrington Estate did not welcome guests, it tolerated them. Perched on a desolate stretch of the Maine coastline, the mansion was a sprawling Gothic revival beast of gray stone and slate, perpetually battered by the Atlantic winds. To the locals in the village below, it was a monument to old money and older secrets. But to Eloise, who drove her battered sedan through the wrought iron gates every evening at sunset, it was simply a place where life was slowly, painfully unwinding. Eloise was 26, a private palliative care nurse whose life was measured in doses of morphine and the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors. She possessed a quiet, almost translucent beauty, pale skin, eyes the color of sea glass, and hands that were perpetually cool and steady. She wore her scrubs like armor, a shield against the grief that saturated her profession. She had learned early on that to survive the dying, one had to build a wall between empathy and attachment. But Eloise's wall was made of glass. She saw everything, felt everything, and simply pretended she didn't. She had been hired 3 weeks ago to care for Arthur Thorrington, the patriarch of the dynasty, a man once feared on Wall Street, now reduced to a frail figure lost in the fog of advanced dementia and heart failure. The house was staffed by a silent army of housekeepers and cooks who moved like shadows, never speaking above a whisper. The silence in the hallways was heavy, pressing against the eardrums, smelling faintly of lemon polish, lavender, and the metallic tang of impending death. We bandaged the body to ignore the bleeding of the soul. It was a Tuesday night, and a storm was brewing off the coast. The wind howled around the turrets, rattling the leaded glass windows of the second-floor master suite. Inside, the only light came from the glow of the medical equipment and the dying embers in the fireplace. Eloise sat by the bedside, reading a paperback by the dim light of a lamp, the rhythmic whoosh click of the oxygen concentrator marking time. Arthur was restless tonight. He muttered in his sleep, names of people long dead, deals long closed. Eloise reached out, adjusting his blanket with practiced tenderness. "It's all right, Arthur," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm in the dark. "You're safe. The storm can't get in." She didn't know if he could hear her. It didn't matter. She spoke to him because no one else did. In the 3 weeks she had been there, she had never seen a visitor. No friends, no business partners, and certainly not a son. She knew about the son, of course. Everyone knew about Zachary Thorrington. He was the wolf of the Waterfront, a ruthless real estate mogul who had taken the family empire and turned it into a weapon. The tabloids painted him as a cold, emotionless machine, a man who had not visited his dying father in 5 years. Eloise had seen his picture in the magazines Arthur kept in the library, a man with devastatingly sharp features, dark hair, and eyes that looked like they could cut glass. She stood up to check the 4 drip, stretching her back. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the bedroom swung open. Eloise jumped, spinning around, her hand flying to her chest. A man stood in the doorway. He was soaking wet, his black trench coat dripping water onto the pristine Persian rug. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered and imposing, filling the frame of the door like a storm cloud that had drifted indoors. It was Zachary. He didn't look like the photos in the magazines. He looked wilder, dangerous. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face was pale, etched with a mixture of exhaustion and a simmering, volatile anger. He didn't look at Eloise. He looked past her, fixing his gaze on the frail man in the bed. "So," Zachary said, his voice a low rasp that scratched against the silence. "He's still holding on." It wasn't a question. It was a statement laced with disappointment. Eloise stepped between the intruder and the patient, her protective instinct overriding her fear. "You can't be in here in this state," she said, keeping her voice low but firm. "He needs rest. You're dripping water all over the sterile field." Zachary's eyes snapped to hers. For the first time, he seemed to register her presence. He looked her up and down, taking in the simple blue scrubs, the messy bun, the defiance in her sea-glass eyes. He looked at her not as a person, but as an obstacle. "I own the floor you're standing on," Zachary said, stepping into the room. "I own the bed he's dying in, and I own the machines keeping him alive. Do not tell me where I can stand." He walked past her, smelling of rain, whiskey, and cold ozone. He stopped at the foot of the bed, staring down at his father. There was no love in his gaze. There was only a deep, ancient bitterness that made the air in the room feel frigid. "He looks small," Zachary muttered almost to himself. "He used to be a giant. Now he's just debris. The deepest scars are the ones that don't leave a mark on the skin." Eloise watched him. She should have called security. She should have left the room. But she saw something in the way his hand clenched at his side. A tremor, barely visible. It was the same tremor she saw in family members who were terrified of their grief. He wasn't just angry. He was in agony. "He can hear you," Eloise whispered, moving to the other side of the bed. "Even if he can't respond. He knows you're here." "Good," Zachary replied coldly. "I want him to know I watched him wither." He reached out, his hand hovering over the railing of the bed. For a second, Eloise thought he might strike the old man. But he didn't. He just gripped the cold metal until his knuckles turned white, fighting a war within himself that Eloise could only guess at. "You should leave," Eloise said, softer this time. "Not because you don't own the house, Mr. Thorrington, but because you're hurting yourself." Zachary froze. He turned his head, slowly to look at her again. The coldness in his eyes cracked, just for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of surprise. No one spoke to Zachary Thorrington like that. No one dared to tell him what he was feeling. "You're the nurse," he said, his voice flat. "I'm Eloise," she corrected him. "Eloise," he repeated, testing the name like a foreign coin. "Well, Eloise, you are paid to monitor his heart. Don't presume to monitor mine." He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, the wet tail of his coat snapping behind him. He didn't close the door. Eloise stood alone in the dim light, the sound of his heavy footsteps retreating down the hall. She looked down at Arthur, who slept on, unaware that his prodigal son had returned not to make peace, but to watch the end. But Eloise knew better. She had seen the tremor. She had seen the crack. And she knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that the dying man in the bed wasn't the only Thorrington who needed saving. The storm had officially entered the house. The storm passed, but it left a heavy, lingering fog that wrapped the Thorrington estate in a shroud of white silence. For 3 days, Zachary did not leave. He haunted the corridors of his childhood home like a restless spirit, his presence a dark stain on the pristine, silent routine Eloise had established. She would turn a corner carrying a tray of medications and find him standing by a window, staring out at the gray Atlantic, a glass of amber liquid always in his hand, though she rarely saw him drink. He was watching her. Eloise felt his gaze like a physical touch, a weight on her shoulders, a prickle at the nape of her neck. He watched her crush pills into applesauce. He watched her adjust the pillows to prevent bed sores. He watched her read poetry to a man who hadn't spoken a coherent sentence in months. It wasn't the gaze of a supervisor checking on an employee. It was the bewildered, intense scrutiny of a man trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't understand. Grief is a language he had forgotten how to speak. On the 4th afternoon, the tension broke in the conservatory. It was a glass-walled room filled with dying orchids and overgrown ferns, a jungle reclaiming the civilization inside. Eloise had gone there to catch her breath, escaping the rhythmic beeping of the monitors for just 5 minutes. She was misting a fern when she heard the heavy door click shut behind her. Zachary stood there. He had traded the trench coat for a charcoal sweater that made him look less like a villain and more like a man weary of his own armor. The jagged line of the conservatory shadows fell across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw. "You read to him," Zachary said. His voice was low, devoid of the aggression from the first night, but still guarded. Poetry. Keats. He likes the rhythm, Eloise replied, not turning away from the plant. She kept her hands busy, afraid that if she stopped, her trembling would betray her. It soothes him. He hated poetry, Zachary countered, walking closer. His footsteps crunched softly on the stray leaves littering the tile floor. He called it a waste of time. He only read ledgers, balance sheets, profit margins. People change when they are dying, Zachary, Eloise said softly, using his name without thinking. The things that used to matter, the money, the anger, they become very small. And the things they ignored become everything. Zachary stopped beside her. He was close enough that she could smell the expensive soap he used, a crisp, clean scent that clashed with the earthy smell of the plants. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching hers, looking for a lie. But Eloise didn't lie. She looked back with the same sea-glass clarity that had disarmed him 3 nights ago. "And you?" Zachary asked, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "What matters to you, Eloise? Watching an old man die in a drafty castle? Is this the dream?" "Caring matters," she answered simply. "Being the one person who doesn't leave when it gets ugly. That matters." The words hung in the humid air between them. Being the one who doesn't leave. It was an arrow aimed straight at his guilt. Zachary flinched, a subtle tightening of his eyes. He looked at her lips, then up to her eyes, and the air in the conservatory suddenly felt thin, charged with a dangerous, magnetic pull. He reached out. For a terrifying second, Eloise thought he was going to take the spray bottle from her. Instead, his hand hovered near her face, his fingers twitching as if fighting a command from his brain. He brushed a stray leaf from her shoulder. The touch was light, scorching, and incredibly intimate. "You have dirt on your cheek," he murmured. He didn't pull his hand away. His thumb grazed her skin, wiping away a smudge of soil she hadn't known was there. His skin was rough, warm, and real. Eloise stopped breathing. The class divide, the billionaire and the nurse, evaporated in the heat of that single touch. She looked at him, seeing the boy who had been hurt, the man who was lonely, and she felt a surge of tenderness that terrified her. "We build walls to keep pain out, but they also keep the light from getting in." "Zachary," she breathed, a warning and a welcome. He leaned in, drawn by a gravity he couldn't resist. His eyes were dark pools of need. He was going to kiss her. Here, among the dying orchids, the wolf of the waterfront was going to kiss the help. But the moment was shattered by the sharp, shrill ring of a cell phone. Zachary pulled back violently, cursing under his breath. He pulled the phone from his pocket, glancing at the screen. His expression shifted instantly from vulnerability to a cold, hard mask of indifference. The wall was back up. "I have to take this," he said, his voice flat. He turned his back on her, walking toward the door. "It's the lawyers. They're drafting the estate liquidation." Liquidation. He was selling the house. He was erasing the history. Eloise stood alone in the conservatory, her cheek still burning from his touch. She realized then that this wasn't just a job anymore. She was falling for the son of the man she was nursing to death, a man who was actively planning to destroy the only home his father had left. Later that evening, the dynamic shifted again. Eloise was in the kitchen, preparing tea, when the front doorbell rang. It was a sound she hadn't heard since she arrived. The housekeepers were gone for the night. Zachary was in the study. Eloise wiped her hands and went to the foyer. She opened the heavy oak door. Standing on the porch was a woman. She was sleek, blonde, and impeccably dressed in a white cashmere coat that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust. She held a leather portfolio and radiated an aura of impatient ownership. This was Serafina Vance, Zachary's business partner, and according to the society pages, his fiancée. Serafina didn't look at Eloise. She looked past her into the foyer, Is he here? Serafina asked, her voice cool and crisp like a winter morning. She didn't wait for an answer. She pushed past Eloise, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor. "Excuse me," Eloise said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Thorrington is working. Who shall I say is calling?" Serafina stopped and finally deigned to look at the nurse. Her blue eyes swept over Eloise's scrubs with a look of mild amusement mixed with disdain. "I don't need to be announced," Serafina said, a cruel smile touching her lips. "I'm the future Mrs. Thorrington, and I'm here to make sure he hasn't done anything sentimental, like cancel the sale." She walked toward the study, leaving Eloise standing in the drafty hall. The truth hit Eloise like a physical blow. He wasn't just grieving, he was engaged. The moment in the conservatory, the touch on her cheek, the vulnerability, it was all a lie. Or worse, a momentary lapse of judgment from a man who belonged to another world. A world where women wore cashmere and sold estates, while women like Eloise cleaned up the mess. The obstacle wasn't just his pain, it was his promise to another. And as Eloise watched Serafina open the study door without knocking, she realized that the healing she thought she was bringing might just be the thing that broke her own heart. The presence of Serafina Vance changed the molecular structure of the air inside the Thorrington estate. Before, the silence had been heavy, yes, but it was a shared silence, a canvas upon which Eloise and Zachary were beginning to paint a tentative understanding. Now, the silence was sharp, brittle, and filled with the static of calculation. The scent of rain and old wood was replaced by the cloying perfume of expensive lilies and the crisp, dry smell of legal documents. For 2 days, Eloise was relegated to the shadows. She stayed in Arthur's room, barricading herself against the cold invasion happening downstairs. She could hear them, Serafina's voice, sharp and demanding, echoing up the grand staircase, followed by the low, defeated rumble of Zachary's responses. They were discussing timelines, renovations, demolition. They were carving up the body of the house while the heart was still beating upstairs. Eloise tried to focus on Arthur. His breathing was becoming shallower, the rhythm of his life slowing down to a crawl. But every time she looked at his pale, weathered face, she saw Zachary. She saw the man who had touched her cheek in the conservatory, the man who had looked at her with such desperate hunger. She tried to reconcile that man with the one who was currently downstairs, signing away his father's sanctuary to a woman who looked at the estate as nothing more than a portfolio asset. We bandaged the body to ignore the bleeding of the soul. On Friday evening, the summons came. A housekeeper, eyes downcast, informed Eloise that Mr. Thorrington required her presence in the library immediately. Eloise smoothed her scrubs, checked Arthur's vitals one last time, and descended the stairs. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She told herself she was a professional. She told herself she didn't care. But her hands were trembling. The library was a cavern of mahogany and leather, illuminated by the harsh glow of a laptop screen and the fire that Zachary fed obsessively. He sat behind the massive desk, a tumbler of whiskey untouched near his hand. Serafina stood by the fireplace, looking triumphant, holding a sheaf of papers. "Ah, the nurse," Serafina said, not bothering to turn fully. Finally, Zachary didn't look up. He was staring at a document on the desk, his pen hovering over the signature line. He looked wrecked, his eyes rimmed with red, his skin pale, the scar on his temple standing out in stark relief. "You wanted to see me?" Eloise asked, directing her question to Zachary. "We have made a decision regarding Arthur's care," Serafina answered, stepping forward to take control. "The sale of the estate is moving forward faster than anticipated. The demolition crew needs access by Monday. Obviously, a construction site is no place for a dying man." Eloise felt a chill run down her spine. "He cannot be moved," she said firmly. His condition is too unstable. The stress of a transport could trigger a fatal cardiac event. He is being transferred to the St. Jude's hospice facility in the city tomorrow morning, Serafina stated, her voice brooking no argument. It is a state-of-the-art facility, much more hygienic than this drafty ruin. It's a warehouse for the forgotten, Eloise snapped, her professional mask slipping. She looked at Zachary, pleading with him to look at her, to be the man she knew was in there. Zachary, you can't do this. He built this house. He wants to die here. You told me he deserves dignity. Zachary finally looked up. The devastation in his eyes was absolute, but it was walled off behind a fortress of ice. He looked at Eloise, and for a heartbreaking second, she saw the apology. She saw the scream trapped in his throat. But then he looked at Serafina, and the wall slammed shut. It is the best option, Zachary said, his voice dead. It is efficient. Efficient. Eloise whispered, the word tasting like ash. He is your father, not a line item. And you are an employee, Serafina cut in, her voice like a whip. You are paid to administer medicine, not moral judgment. Your contract is terminated as of tomorrow morning when the ambulance arrives. We won't be needing you at the new facility. They have their own staff. Eloise looked at Zachary. She waited for him to fight. She waited for him to tell Serafina that Eloise was the only one who knew how to soothe his father's nightmares. She waited for him to remember the touch in the conservatory. But Zachary didn't fight. He looked down at the paper. Sign it, darling, Serafina urged softly. Let's be done with this ghost story. Zachary's hand shook. The tip of the pen touched the paper. And then, with a jagged, angry motion, he signed his name. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was loud in the silent room, a sound of finality, of surrender. He had signed the eviction notice for his dying father, and he had signed the termination of whatever fragile thing had started to grow between him and Eloise. You should pack your things, Zachary said, still looking at the signature. I will have the driver take you home tonight. I don't need your driver, Eloise said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and grief. And I don't need your money. She walked up to the desk. She wanted to slap him. She wanted to shake him. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, silver pocket watch she had found on Arthur's nightstand, the one Zachary had asked about on his first night, the one he thought was lost. She placed it gently on the desk, right on top of the eviction papers. He asked for you today, Eloise lied. Arthur hadn't spoken, but she needed Zachary to feel the weight of his abandonment. He wanted to know if the storm was over. I told him yes. I didn't know I was lying. She turned to Serafina. You can have the house. It's just stones, but you will never have the home. Eloise turned and walked out of the library. She didn't run. She walked with the dignity of someone who knows they are the only person in the room with a clean conscience. She climbed the stairs to pack her bag, leaving the door open so she could hear the silence downstairs. But it wasn't silent. As she reached the landing, she heard the sound of glass shattering against a wall. Zachary had thrown the tumbler. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The separation was absolute. He had chosen the armor over the heart, the deal over the dignity. Eloise packed her bag in the dim light of the nurse's quarters, tears finally streaming down her face. She wasn't crying for the job. She wasn't even crying for Arthur, who would soon be beyond pain. She was crying for Zachary, the man who had stood in the rain and looked at her like she was salvation, only to prove that he was too in love with his own damnation to be saved. The night did not end. It simply bled into a bruised, gray dawn. Eloise sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the servants' quarters, her packed bag at her feet. She had spent the last hours staring at the wall, listening to the wind battering the stone face of the house. The ambulance was scheduled for 8 a.m. In 2 hours, Arthur would be moved to the sterile warehouse Serafina had chosen, and Eloise would be nothing more than a memory in the Thorrington history, a brief flash of color in a black-and-white tragedy. She couldn't leave without saying goodbye. Not to Zachary. She had said her goodbye to him with the silver watch on the desk, but to Arthur. The old man had been her charge, her responsibility. To leave without a final check of his vitals felt like a dereliction of the soul. Eloise crept down the hallway. The house was silent, but it was the silence of a held breath, tense and suffocating. The door to the master suite was ajar. She pushed it open gently, expecting to find Arthur alone. She was wrong. Zachary was there. He was sitting in the chair she usually occupied, slumped forward, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He was still wearing the clothes from the night before, rumpled and smelling of stale whiskey and smoke. On the nightstand, next to the rhythmic rise and fall of the oxygen machine, sat a stack of yellowed papers, not the glossy contract Seraphina had brandished, but old, crumbling documents. Eloise froze. She should turn back, but the sound of a ragged, shuddering breath stopped her. Zachary was crying. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the terrifying, silent weeping of a man who has forgotten how to make noise. "I tried, Dad," Zachary whispered into the darkness. "I tried to keep the wolves out, but I ran out of walls." Eloise stepped into the room. The floorboard creaked under her foot. Zachary's head snapped up. His eyes were red-rimmed, wild, stripped of all defenses. He looked at Eloise, and for the first time, he didn't put the mask back on. He was too tired. He was too broken. "You're still here," he rasped. "The ambulance hasn't arrived," Eloise said softly, walking toward the bed. "I came to check his pulse." "His pulse is strong," Zachary said bitterly, gesturing to his sleeping father. "It's his legacy that's dead." He picked up the yellowed papers and threw them onto the floor. They scattered like dead leaves. "Read them," Zachary commanded. "Since you think I'm such a monster, since you think I'm selling him out for a profit, read them, Eloise." Eloise hesitated, then bent down to pick up a document. It was a loan agreement, dated 10 years ago. It was a high-risk loan from the Vance Family Trust, Seraphina's family, borrowed against the Thorrington Estate. The numbers were staggering, and below that, a police report draft, evidence of embezzlement. Arthur Thorrington hadn't just lost money, he had stolen it to cover his tracks. Eloise gasped, looking up at Zachary. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with a sickening clarity. "He didn't just fail," Zachary whispered, his voice trembling. "He committed fraud. 10 years ago. The Van Cess covered it up. They bought his debt, and they bought his silence. They own everything, Eloise. Every stone, every painting, every breath in this house. Seraphina isn't my fiancée because I love her. She's the warden." The truth washed over Eloise like ice water. The wolf of the waterfront wasn't a predator, he was a hostage. He hadn't visited his father for 5 years, not because he hated him, but because he had been spending every waking hour trying to pay off a debt that could never be settled. He was marrying Seraphina to keep his father out of prison, even now at the end. "You're selling the house to pay the final installment," Eloise realized, her voice barely audible. "To keep his name clean after he dies." "I am buying his dignity," Zachary corrected her, tears streaming down his face. "I let the world think I was the villain. I let you think I was the villain, because it was easier than telling you that my father, the great Arthur Thorrington, was a thief. We bandaged the body to ignore the bleeding of the soul." The leitmotif returned, haunting the room. Zachary had spent a decade bandaging his father's reputation, ignoring the fact that his own soul was bleeding out on the floor. Eloise dropped the papers. She didn't care about the fraud. She didn't care about the Van Cess. She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. "You idiot!" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. His skin was fever-hot. He looked at her with a mixture of shame and desperate longing, like a man drowning who is afraid to grab the rope. "You aren't a monster, Zachary," she said fiercely. "You are the most fiercely loyal man I have ever met. You set yourself on fire to keep him warm. And now I'm ash," Zachary choked out. "I have nothing left, Eloise. The house is gone. My life is signed away to Seraphina. I have nothing to offer you." "I don't want the house," Eloise said, her thumbs brushing away his tears. "And I don't want a hero. I just want the man who cleaned the dirt off my cheek in the conservatory." Zachary let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "I can't stop the ambulance," he confessed into her scrubs. "Seraphina holds the deed. If I fight her, she releases the police report. She destroys his memory. Then let her have the deed," Eloise said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "Let her have the stones, but don't let her have you. You paid the debt, Zachary. You gave up 10 years of your life. Isn't that enough?" "It has to be," he whispered. He stood up then, towering over her, but without the intimidation. He looked at his father sleeping peacefully in the bed, then at the woman standing in the wreckage of his life. He made a decision. It wasn't a strategic business move. It was a move of the heart. "I can't stop them from taking him," Zachary said, his voice gaining a new, dangerous steel. "But I can choose where I go when the ambulance leaves." He took Eloise's hand. His grip was tight, possessive, desperate. "Stay with me until they come," he pleaded. "Just until the siren starts. After that, I promise, I will find a way to break the contract." "I'm not going anywhere," Eloise vowed. They sat together on the edge of the bed as the sun finally broke over the horizon, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The secret was out, the wound was exposed, and for the first time they were bleeding together. The pain was deep, yes, but it was no longer lonely. And in the quiet before the chaos of the morning arrived, a fragile, terrifying hope began to take root in the ruins of the Thorrington Estate. The flashing red lights of the ambulance painted the gray stone of the Thorrington Estate in a violent, rhythmic pulse. It was 8 a.m., but the sun seemed reluctant to rise, hiding behind a thick curtain of Atlantic fog. The silence of the house, the silence Eloise had come to know so intimately, was finally shattered by the static of radios and the clatter of the gurney wheels on the cobblestones. Arthur Thorrington was leaving his kingdom. He looked small under the white sheets, a fragile relic being evicted from the museum he had built. Eloise walked beside the stretcher, holding his hand until the very last moment, whispering final assurances that he likely couldn't hear, but that his soul might feel. Zachary stood on the bottom step of the grand porch. He wore a black wool coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He watched the paramedics load his father with a stoic, terrifying calmness. He wasn't looking at the ambulance, though. He was looking at the house. He was memorizing the cracks in the facade, the gargoyles that had watched him grow up, the windows of the room where he had learned to hide his heart. Seraphina Vance stood by her sleek limousine, checking her watch. She looked impatient, as if death were an inconvenience to her schedule. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, sealing Arthur inside, she turned to Zachary. "It's done," she said, her voice cutting through the damp air. "The demolition crew arrives at noon. Get in the car, Zachary. We have a press release to draft about the transition." Zachary didn't move. He watched the ambulance pull away, its siren wailing a mournful song as it disappeared down the winding drive. "Zachary," Seraphina snapped, opening the back door of the limo. "Don't be dramatic. We have a schedule." Zachary turned his head slowly. He looked at Seraphina, the woman who held his debt, his father's reputation, and his future in her manicured hands. He looked at the house that had been his prison, and then he looked past the limousine to the battered sedan parked near the gate. Eloise was standing there. She hadn't left. She was leaning against her car, her arms crossed against the cold, waiting. "You have the house, Seraphina," Zachary said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "You have the land. You have the silence. I have you," she corrected him, narrowing her eyes. "We have a contract." "The contract was for the debt," Zachary replied, stepping off the porch. He didn't walk toward her. He walked away from her. "The debt is paid. The assets are yours. But I am not an asset. I am not a line item. If you walk away," Seraphina hissed, her composure cracking, "I will release the police report. I will tell the world Arthur Thorrington was a thief. I will ruin his legacy." Zachary stopped. He looked back at her one last time, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. "Go ahead," he said. "The truth is a lighter burden than the lie I've been carrying for 10 years. Burn his legacy if you want. I'm going to go live my life." He turned his back on the heiress, the limo, and the mansion. He walked across the gravel, the sound of his footsteps steady and sure. He walked straight to the battered sedan. Eloise opened the passenger door. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him with those sea-glass eyes that saw everything. Zachary got in. He didn't look back as Eloise put the car in gear and drove through the iron gates, leaving the Thorrington Estate to the wolves and the wrecking balls. 6 months later, the wind still smelled of salt, but it was warmer. Arthur had passed away 3 days after arriving at the hospice. He died quietly, in his sleep, holding Zachary's hand. The scandal Seraphina threatened never materialized. She was too busy turning the estate into a luxury resort to risk devaluing the property with a public controversy. The silence she bought had ultimately silenced her, too. Zachary and Eloise lived in a small, weathered cottage 20 miles down the coast. It was a place of peeling paint and drafty windows, but it was filled with light. Zachary worked at a local boatyard, stripping varnish and sanding wood, manual labor that exhausted his body but quieted his mind. He no longer wore suits. He wore flannel and sawdust, and he smiled often. On this particular evening, the sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Eloise sat on the back porch, watching the tide come in. Zachary stepped out behind her, 2 mugs of tea in his hands. He sat beside her, the wood creaking comfortably under his weight. He handed her the tea and rested his hand on her knee. The touch was no longer tentative. It was the anchor of their lives. "Do you miss it?" Eloise asked, looking out at the horizon. "The power? The view from the castle?" Zachary laughed softly, a sound that rumbled in his chest. "The view from the castle was just stone and fog, Eloise. I couldn't see anything. Here, I can see the whole world." He leaned over and kissed her temple. "I spent my whole life trying to pay a debt that wasn't mine. I thought if I suffered enough, it would count as love. And now I know that love isn't a transaction," Zachary whispered. "It's just staying. It's sitting on a porch and drinking tea and knowing you aren't alone. We bandage the body to ignore the bleeding of the soul." The leitmotif returned to them, drifting on the sea breeze, but it had lost its sting. They were no longer bandaging wounds to hide them. They had ripped off the bandages, exposed the scars to the salt air and the sunlight, and allowed them to truly heal. The bleeding had stopped. Zachary took Eloise's hand, interlacing their fingers. He looked at the woman who had walked into a house of death and brought life with her. He looked at the nurse who had treated his father's body but had healed his own spirit. "Thank you," he murmured against her skin. "For what?" "For seeing the man behind the wall," Zachary said, "and for being brave enough to knock it down." They sat together as the stars began to puncture the twilight, 2 survivors of a storm that had destroyed a dynasty but built a home. The Thorrington name would eventually fade from the gossip columns, buried under the foundations of Seraphina's resort. But in a small cottage by the sea, the man who had been a wolf and the woman who had been a ghost found something far more enduring than a legacy. He had been assigned to watch his father die, but in the quiet hours of the night, under the watch of a nurse with eyes like the sea, he finally learned how to live.